Hello and most welcome to 1788 of the Heidegger series. We will continue where we left off at 1786 with Kripke on Wittgenstein on Rules by Warren Goldfarb. The Kripkean vision of a physicality in our soul, or that consciousness only exists as some sort of physical reference, is not an odd view. I would say that is the only view you would find within philosophy today, with some little almost superficial differences. For instance, you can compare David Chalmers with Couples Churchland, and you can compare that to the people who are professing to be pantheists now, which is becoming common. Is there a difference? Slight, I would say. So what is on the game table here, so to speak, is something that everybody obeys. Kripke is obeyed by everyone. So it's important to take that battle, I'd say. It's hard to see the flaw in the thinking of Kripke as well. It's not a flaw in the regular meaning. It is a confusion of what is a concept and what is empirical. And as late as today, I heard the professor say that probably in the future, a physical examination of someone's brain can tell whether that person is impressed by a rhetorical speech or not, and to what level. So we are already in the Kripkean situation, so to speak. But it is, as Goldfarb points out, underneath, when you really go to the grits, problematic. Reductionism is a live thing, and it cannot be scientifically proven wrong since it's a conceptual problem. And all the explanations today do stems from an idea that they, one time in the future or now, can be reduced to a sort of physical examination. And meaning itself is a sort of physicality. So I will stop the video and we will continue where we left off at page 477. And the last word was actually in a certain way. But I remember it was in the third paragraph. How is it coming now? It's further down. It is a certain way, but it's on page 477. And it's in the third paragraph of 477. There you have it. And it's a good quote as well. Kripke connects this with justification. Any candidate for a fact of meaning must in some sense show how I am justified in going on to use the word in a certain way. So simply, language is not enough. We need something that is vaguely referring to as being of the empirical fashion. And we can bring the text up to the blackboard. And we need to go down a bit there, yeah. The reductionists imagined above does have an answer. If we do find physical states that can, on intentional grounds, be distinguished as competency states as well as other states that are interfering. And we need to go up. Mechanism, then clearly that will be enough to ground the notion of how the person would ideally respond as different from how the person actually responds. In the difference, the normative force of an ascription of meaning can be lodged. To be sure, on this account, the true justifications of our judgments of correctness of responses are hidden. They are masters of the facts deep in the brain. Now Kripke, in saying the fact must show how I am justified, does seem to mean that the justifications must in some sense be transparent. Yet I see no reason for the reductionist to accept this. Indeed, there is a standard reductionist response on the issue. Of course, These physical states are not what we consciously reflect upon in our ordinary ascriptions of meaning. And it does not feel as we are making physiological hypotheses. That is talking about hidden physical states, but that is exactly what we are doing. Just as we're talking about molecular constitution when we say that the glass is filled with water. Yet it can be urged that meaning is, so to speak, transparent. We operate fluently with the notion. We are ordinarily quite certain in our ascriptions. When doubt arises, we know how to proceed, and our procedures do not include physiological investigation. These practices reflect conceptual features of our notion of meaning. No reduction to hidden physical facts can carry these conceptual features with it. In that state, meaning is not conceptually constituted by physical state. This seems crucial to Kripke's conclusion that there are no facts of meaning. A re-examination of an earlier step in Kripke's argument supports the point. Surely, some reductionists would reject Kripke's demand that a physical state identifiable with meaning have a reasonably tight causal relation to the potential infinity of future correct responses. For example, one could propose to identify meaning table by table with a physical state which is caused by a certain linguistic training involving tables and which causes ascent and descent as appropriate in a few paradigmatic confrontations with the objects that are or are not tables. Such an identification is neither gratuitous nor existentially faulty. Since if a person receives such training and voices a few correct responses, then, as a matter of fact, that person will mean table by table. Kripke's noting that it is possible that someone received this training and voiced their responses, yet not mean table by table, would be dismissed by this reductionist, who takes as irrelevant any concern for the actual world. The weight of Kripke's objection then has to lie in the insistence that the fact of meaning determine in a direct way what the correct responses are in cases beyond the paradigmatic cases used in this reduction. This turns out to be the punch of normativity. Yet our reductionist here would deny such a responsibility, admitting that there is much about the notion of meaning that a physical reduction does not capture. How much reduction should be required to capture, we may surmise, is a debatable issue. But clearly Kripke's conclusion is justified only if a heavy burden of conceptual adequacy is put on the identification of a fact of meaning. We can go up a bit. The idea that the isolation of a fact of meaning does bear some burden is not entirely foreign to Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein does apparently argue that an examination of our practices of ascribing meaning, intending, and understanding will undercut the notion that meaning and the rest are to be analyzed as underlying states. it is a subtle matter. To render Wittgenstein convincing here, it is, I think, even harder to do so with Kripke. For in giving us the physicalist picture of fact, Kripke may well be providing the wherewithal to deny that the conceptual burden need to be borne. Even by itself, the conceptual burden Kripke exploits is difficult to assess. His challenge marries the idea that our ordinary practices exhibit conceptual features that must be preserved, to the idea that those practices do not yield true justification of our ascriptions, since they do not fend off bizarre Goodmanesque possibilities. These two ideas pull in opposite directions. It is no wonder that nothing can meet the demands imposed by the two in tandem. In sum, Kripke's concern is with physicalist reductions of meaning notions, a concern that is narrower than Wittgenstein and arises on a different basis. And Kripke's challenge relies on a highly problematic mixture of demands imposed on reductions. Thus, it does not appear that Kripke has provided the means to illuminate Wittgenstein's views on the nature of meaning, or the ways in which the rule-following considerations are to support them. With respect to reductionism, though, Kripke's argument does raise important issues. His emphasis on the role of meaning ascriptions in discourse elicits difficulties in formulating the criteria for identifying any particular physical state with meaning. In the face of these difficulties, the question of how candidates for physical meaning states are to be located cannot be answered by vague allusions to the causal effects of physical states or to a simple notion of concomitance. The issue has, I think, been taken to be better understood and more subtle than in fact it is. Kripke has forcefully presented considerations that destroy this complency and suggest the clarification progress that needs to be made. Whatever flaws there may be in Kripke's challenge, do not render it pointless to examine what he offers as a solution. That solution is meant to do more than overcome the paradox Kripke takes his challenge to present. It is claimed to yield a distinction between language and private language, through which the latter notion is shown to be incoherent. As such, it might well be illuminating of Wittgenstein. It should be noted that Kripke's use of private language differs from Wittgenstein's. Wittgenstein characterizes the notion thus: the individual words of the language are to refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations, so another person cannot understand the language. What Kripke imagines is rather a language, the constitution of which depends on properties of each speaker taken in isolation. There is no notion of private object and no mention of necessary unintelligibility to others. Hence, I shall call Kripke's notion that of a solitary language. Evidently, it is a more general notion than Wittgenstein's. So the impossibility of a solitary language would yield a fortiori that of a private language in Wittgenstein's sense. Kripke's solution starts by accepting the conclusion of his challenge that there are no facts with which meaning a certain word in a certain way can be identified. For this reason, Kripke called his solution a skeptical solution. Kripke then claims that given the lack of facts to legitimize ascriptions of meaning, we must be able to specify the conditions under which it is licensed to make such ascriptions and the conditions under which it is licensed to assert that a speaker's response is in accord with what the speaker meant in the past. The requirement that we be able to provide such assertability conditions is meant to be relatively weak. Only a rough specification is needed. And there's no demand for comprehensiveness or any sort of hierarchical ordering. In this way, Kripke distinguishes his requirement from a commitment to a theory that identifies the content of a sentence with its assertability conditions. Kripke's requirement is thus pretty much unexceptionally sexual and to some extent plausibly found in Wittgenstein's practice. Kripke then considers the case of a solitary language. Here, we are to imagine that the conditions for license ascription of a certain meaning or ascription of adherence to a certain rule to a person invoke only properties of the person in isolation. Kripke argues that such conditions will imply that it is licensed to ascribe that meaning or ascribe adherence to that rule if the person responds as he is inclined to respond. The point is meant to explicate Wittgenstein's remark that in some such case, thinking was obeying the rule would be the same thing as obeying it. I shall question Kripke's conclusion later, but if it is correct, then clearly the ascription of meaning is empty. As Kripke says, the notion of a rule as guiding the person who adopts it can have no substantive content. In that case, we cannot be said to be talking of language here, and the incoherence of solitary language is shown. In the case of public language, Kripke does find assertability conditions that yield substantive content to the notion of a person's meaning a word in a certain way, and hence speaking a language. Those conditions, however, explicitly bring in the person's relation to a community of speakers and thus go beyond the individual in isolation. They do this by relying on agreement. The conditions for license ascription of meaning are that the person's responses agree with those of the rest of the community. Kripke says Smith will judge Jones to mean addition by plus only if he judges that Jones' answers agree with those he intended to give. And if the individual no longer conforms to what the community would do in these circumstances, the community can no longer attribute the concept to him. Thus, Kripke sees the community as providing what is needed for a distinction between how a person is inclined to respond and what is demanded by a licensed ascription of meaning. The consequence obtained in the solitary case, that anything a person takes to be correct, is blocked. Kripke emphasizes the limited role of acceptability conditions. They are not conditions for the correctness of ascriptions of meaning or the correctness of future responses of a speaker given an ascription. They are merely the conditions that speakers, let's go to the next, in fact obey in their ascriptions and their assessment of responses. They describe the circumstances under which it is taken to be appropriate to ascribe and to approve a response. Given this limited role, no Kripkean challenge can be raised against the account of meaning ascription they provide. The insufficiency of responses to date is granted, but harmless. Questions of the ultimate grounds for decisions between competing meaning hypotheses are irrelevant. The normativity of ascriptions of meaning is part captured by the distinction between what the community agrees on and individuals' momentary inclinations. For the rest, that is, insofar as ascriptions of meaning might previously have been thought to provide justification for the correctness of future responses, normativity is jettisoned. And here I'll put a pause for 1788. We ended at page 482 and with the word jettisoned. Jettisoned. Normativity is jettisoned. So let me look for some quotes. So Kripke does a limited take on the, what can I say, Wittgensteinian idea of quantum relativity. He says that the rules can be discernible and not including everything. It is a limited understanding. We can look at page 479. In the second paragraph, so he got it half right, so to speak. Listen to this. The idea that the isolation of a fact or meaning does bear some such burden is not entirely foreign to Wittgenstein. There is some point to it, but what he goes into is to construct not a private language, but private rules. He thinks that solitary language is a possibility. In page 480, the third line and the question of how candidates for a physical meaning states are to be located cannot be answered by vague allusions to the causal effects of the physical states, or to a simple notion of concomitance. So Kripke is suggesting a limitation of the idea that everything counts. So you can take something out of context to a certain degree, and then you can say, it is following particular rules. That is not correct with Wittgenstein. If we go to the quote on private language from Philosophical Investigations 243, a bit down on the page, if you please. There. The individual words of this language are to refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations. So another person cannot understand the language. And listen now. What Kripke imagines is rather a language, the constitution of which depends on properties of each speaker taken in isolation. There is no notion of private object and no mention of necessary unintelligibility to others. Hence, I shall call Kripke's notion that of a solitary language. It is extremely fitting. Compare that to the text we learned earlier on is a solitary language, or as I would call it, private rules for what something counts as being real, true, solid, pure, is when you invent the rule that a scroll you can find in the Qumran beats what everyone else is using. That is a construction of a private rule. It could be shared by others, but it's not in the general way of talking. It is not how we speak of truth. You invent something new. And so do Kripke. He is not accepting the paradox of the scarabee. In some certain way, he's actually saying, you could make yourself known to yourself at least. You can know what you're talking about. And thereby he does something very dangerous. By this slight misunderstanding, all of a sudden the point of scarabee disappears. And all of a sudden we could somehow construct private rules for what counts as truth, empirically correct, original, and actually all the words in the language can be constructed with some sort of private regulation. And this is exactly Kripke's illusion is shared by everyone or almost everyone. And it's shown here, I would say, it is very close to physical reductionism. And we can see the reason why Kripke and his followers are wrong on page 481. The quote here, thinking one was obeying the rule would be the same thing as obeying it. And that is problematic. By doing something correctly, so to speak, correctly in parenthesis, double parenthesis, you are performing, you are actually doing it live. And that is what counts as correct. Not a set of rules. So Kripke is very close to the idea of classical laws of what is to be true. The idea of physicality is not far off. It's very close. And thereby he is adhering to the old view that, for instance, looking for an original would be very helpful, or to know whether somebody is thinking in a certain way, we can actually go to that person's brain state. And we see clearly the problems on that on the next page. My last quote, page 482. The normativity is now 12 lines down. The normativity of ascriptions of meaning is in part captured by the distinction between what the community agrees on and an individual's momentary inclination. For the rest, that is, insofar as ascriptions of meaning might previously have been thought to provide justifications for the correctness of future responses, normativity is jettisoned. It's a sort of limited normativity. To give an example, the Lutheran sola scriptura is Martin Luther and other people inventing the idea that there are rules for what counts as true in the scripture. And they are themselves applying these rules in isolation, so to speak, isolated from history, but mostly isolated from the doings that went on previously. They became blind to what sort of doings, what sort of action actually goes in to make a concept live. The flesh and the bones of a concept lies in how we use it, that we use it. At the bottom of abstraction lies actual movement. And we saw that in Barbara Tversky, that proved that once you go into complexity, you need to do the concepts. And they do not follow some rules you can make up a priori or that is limited to that person. They are actually joining in on a communal way of understanding that cannot be isolated. Mr. Kalle Lundahl, please join.
Thank you. Let's go to the crucial passage, which you mentioned. And let me compare it with the Scarby image by Wittgenstein. Let me see if I can find it. Scarby Wittgenstein. Oh, it's the French one. I don't know why French. English.
Often called in English the beetle in the box.
Yes, thank you. And now it's this physical book. Well, this was not my point. 2005 book by Martin Cohen. The bit in a box.
I can add to the knowledge. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, please. Let me see if I can find a good image of that to illustrate. But no, it doesn't have a image. But please tell me if you have something.
Also, the Augustine, the philosopher, he made a private rule, so to speak, that you know what the thing are the way you point to it, the ostensive definition. You point to it. Lovely beetle.
Yes, within the box. I don't know if somebody has actually done an illustration of it. Not here really. That's bad. No. But okay, let's imagine that we have a group of people and all of them have a box. And the box contains the beetle. And they should describe it to each other. But everybody would give a different explanation because it's difficult to describe the beetle. Don't you agree that's the correct description of it? Hans.
Sorry, you fell off for. Could you please repeat?
Yes. So you have a group of people, and each of them has a box, and each person should describe what this person has in its box, and the thing that this person has in its box is a beetle. But it's difficult to describe beetle.
Yes,
And you have it here. So this Wittgenstein, no one can look into anyone else's box. Anyone says he knows what beetle is
yeah,
only by looking at
very
his
good.
beetle. Mm-hmm.
In a nutshell, it's a paradox, and I would say Kripke has accepted the paradox just to a certain level, which makes it even more tricky. I think the reason why Kripke is so popular in all subjects is because he almost accepts it, but he doesn't go the whole way. No one can know, even if you have a beetle yourself in your box, because you don't have any criteria, you don't have any corollary.
Yes, we could, for the sake of argument, we could replace the beetle with the Bible, as you mentioned earlier, the
Yeah,
sola scriptura doctrine, and every book would have each one's own Bible. It doesn't have a context, but somewhat is quoting, this is the Bible, okay,
yeah,
and this is the truth.
exactly. Very good, Kalle. That's fantastic. Yes, very good. That's exactly the point. Or
Yes,
the
so
meaning in a certain part of the Bible, or the truth of a certain part of the Bible.
mhm.
Exactly.
And in Wittgen's experiment, we really would have a beetle. Everybody would be almost desperate. Don't you understand what a beetle is? I'm describing to you.
Yeah.
And the Bible, this is the Bible, this is the only Bible, but it's closed off from everything else.
Yeah. It's closed off from the world, from all our interactions. It's closed off from everything that passed before. It's closed off from every human being. It's closed off from language, thinking, emotions, intentions.
Hmm. So let me now try to paraphrase this and try to understand where Kripke went wrong. Um, is So solitary language, so where does Kripke go wrong, so to say? So let's say Kripke has a beetle, he's also there in the room, and he thinks that, um, hmm, so he thinks that he's able to have a described beetle for himself, that is possible. Because Kripke, so to say, holding a monologue for himself, that's possible, according to
Mm.
Kripke. That's his point.
Yes, he has a solitary language. You can imagine somebody being alone on an island, something like that.
I was thinking about Adolf Hitler. He was famous for holding monologues, and in one sense, Hitler himself understood them, but there was sort of language, so to say. I don't know how much everybody else understood of them.
No, I think that's a good example as well. Some people are very off from being understood in the idea, or I wouldn't call it an idea, but they automatically go to something they think is a possibility of a private language. Or even more likely, when I think about it, they're not even aware of it.
But let's try to defend Kripke. Let's say that I, Kalle, I am speaking to myself. And if I understand it, what is the problem then? But the problem is that, of course, I create a ball. What is the point of speak to myself? And when I cannot communicate to each other, so there is no point of with that.
No, 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 exactly. Private language is also more or less the same as the universal grammar of Noam Chomsky. It doesn't look that way, but if you think carefully of it, it's a language that is not participating in anything at all.
Mm. and in this physical language, excuse me, and the physical state in this solitary language example would be your mouth, for instance. You see the lips moving, so it's reacting to something, but it remains there, lips moving without. Yes, you have a physical reaction to some extent, but when it doesn't reach others, doesn't have meaning. Um, so perhaps you could say that Kripke's point remains there. Okay, if you speak to yourself, only you understand. Okay, you see your lips moving, so you have a physical state. You could perhaps control that, and there is some physical activity in your body, but that is not the point. The point is, can you reach others?
Yeah. Do you reach others? Are you making sense?
Or to return to this example that you mentioned, you were studying rhetorics, Hans, and you said today your teacher said that perhaps sometime in the future you can actually control people's brains and see what effect a great
Yeah.
speech can have on
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
But okay, that would be like only, so to say, reacting to, like it would be remain on the lip level also one day. Or what, how would you say there in physical
I
state?
would say it's taken under the illusion that there is actually a box inside of the head, and there you
Mm.
can look inside and you can find meaning in a solitary fashion. So inside in the box in the head, you find
Mm.
meaning and you find some sort of measurement, but you
Mm.
have nothing to compare with. There is no
Mm.
participation.
That's very good, Hans, actually. So you now place the beetle in the box with the brain in the box, so to say.
Oh yeah.
You isolate them. So therefore, your teacher's argument is invalid.
It's invalid.
Because you cannot isolate them from others. So your teacher says that meaning is possible without communication, so to
Without
say.
communication, without participation, without anything in the world. It's simply inside of the brain and not the whole brain, but imagine a certain part of the brain you find meaning. And what would be the meaning of that meaning?
And yes, absolutely. And both Heidegger and Derrida said that intelligence is in the hands.
Yeah,
So in this
exactly.
case, let's say you would include at least four hands, the speaker's hands in your own too, that
Yeah,
your teacher forgets, and of course all the people in the audience.
exactly.
And for instance, if you go to a rock concert, I've never been to a rock concert, but they all move in one there's a unison movement. So you would exclude everything uh, in this metaphor, so to say.
Yeah, definitely. It would also be a bit similar to the video where this director Bernstein, I think it's called, and he was rehearsing uh, Nimrod by the English Elgar, and
Mm.
you take Bernstein out of the composition and you isolate him. I imagine you can do this by modern film technique, and you only have him moving his lips, moving his arms, and you say the whole music can be found within Bernstein somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make it, it's impossible, of course. He needs the orchestra, he needs the connection to what piece he's playing. And then, of course, his gestures are understandable by the violinist and the trumpets, but
Mm.
not in isolation. Not in isolation. There is no trace, so to speak, inside Bernstein. Maybe there's some trace, but it's not enough by any means to understand Helgar's Nimrod. No, doesn't make sense.
Well, perhaps we should end there.
Well, yeah. Why, thank you very much, Kalle Lundahl, for participating. Thank you very much for listening in, everyone. Have a very pleasant morning, day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.